We're going to finish up chapter 3 today, and I don't know if about you, but when reading this chapter or rereading it, I could not help but make so many connections with, our current state of affairs internationally, nationally, in terms of trying to reach a people who are numb and will not hear. I think it's the best way to put it. It's how Brueggemann puts it. And this was the case of Jeremiah. We've been looking at the prophet Jeremiah as a kind of embodiment of the idea of prophetic criticizing. Remember how, the twin callings of the prophet are to criticize and to energize. You can't get a better embodiment of the critical orientation or the critical perspective than Jeremiah. His uh, historical circumstances, the context in which he found himself. Here he was, I talked a little bit last time about his pedigree as a Levitical priest from Anatoth, uh, who 400, 500, 400 years prior to this time, he would have been prophesying somewhere around 620 to 587 BCE. Um, but he was a descendant of this group of priests who were really exiled from the temple during the time of Solomon. Abiathar was the priest, and then, of course, Solomon threw him out because Abiathar, supported Solomon's brother Absalom, or excuse me, Adonijah, in the conflict that took place when David died, who was going to be king. And naturally, Adonijah, the older brother, was defeated by Solomon. Abiathar hightailed it up to this place called Anatoth, and there it created a prophetic community, you might say, that tried to maintain a sense of loyalty to the original idea of, the temple and its cultus. And so you might imagine that they had a perspective that was a little more closely allied to the Mosaic uh, alternative community. But the priest that Solomon put in place, Zadok, was going to be one that was going to perpetuate what we've been calling the royal consciousness. So you might say 400 years later, with Jeremiah coming into Jerusalem, the so-called chickens are coming home to roost. The people whose leaderships began under the priest Abiathar, the prophets, have maintained a kind of idealized idea of who they were. And now Jeremiah is going to bring that back to Jerusalem. And as Brueggemann says, he pretty much embodies the alternative consciousness that we've been talking about, the alternative consciousness that begins with Moses, the alternative community focused on a sense of righteousness, a sense of justice. And Jeremiah is bringing the critical message that while death did pass over at one time in Israel's history of the Hebrew people, uh, death is not going to pass over this time. There will be no Passover. And that is the message that he comes to bring, uh, despite the fact that nobody wants to listen to him. He's meddlesome. At one point, he's almost killed. He's thrown into a cistern and left there to die. Uh, he, it's not like he is trying to criticize the people out of anger or out of any kind of aggression. What he's doing is he is embodying the grief that comes with God's perception of what's happening in Judah. And in many ways, I mean, as I've been reading this, I've been thinking about the idea of incarnation, right? And this is an early form of incarnation, you might say, not as we see it, where God becomes, fully God and fully human in Jesus, but an embodiment of the pathos of God. And it becomes even clearer as we get into Jeremiah's um, to his message in his poetry. Poetry that uses metaphor. Uh, Perhaps he's the one prophet, in addition to Hosea, who can use the metaphor of family and of romantic love. Uh, you might remember that Hosea, prophesying to the northern kingdom of Israel, uh, was told by God, I want you to go out and I want you to marry a woman of whoredom, as she was referred to. Gomer was her name. And I want you, Hosea, says God, to experience what it's like for me, God, to be the jilted lover, to watch my wife go out and sleep with all these other men, i.e., worship all of these other gods and participate in their religious ceremonies. And Jeremiah is doing a little bit of that as well. In fact, at one point, he does liken the people of Judah to a whore who has no place. Now, I probably should at this time mention the inherent misogyny that that is attendant to this. But it's one of those metaphors that speaks deeply to an experience of human grief. Another metaphor that he's going to use is the loss of a child. So the loss of a lover, the loss of a child, also the loss of one's place. I think about the pain that must have been experienced by the people in California's burned over district, as they're calling it, in the Palisades. Uh, Houses that people have lived in and for lifetimes, and that is completely swept away by the fires that happened about a year ago. This month, all of that is being taken into the experience of Jeremiah, and he's embodying the grief that comes with that. There's this level of grief about for his people and the people. I want to kind of develop this a little bit. The people and the land go together. We, in our 21st and 20th or post-scientific age, often think of people as, these transitory objects that rest upon any landscape whatsoever. This is all a part of our American heritage and identity of manifest destiny. We live here, but we can easily live someplace else. But when your God is associated with the mountain of Zion, then you too come to be associated. Your whole identity comes to be associated with the mountain of Zion or Jerusalem itself. I mean, the very spirit of that landscape, seeps into your entire sense of identity. Uh, but there is a disconnect that is happening, and Jeremiah is grieving over this. The metaphors he are going to use are going to try to shake the people out of their numbness, but as we know, it does not happen. So that's kind of where we were last time. Are there any uh, thoughts about this? Now, Denny, I know you've been writing in the margins of your book copiously. And I would like to hear, from folks as you're reading Jeremiah and the grief of seeing a nation, a people uh, being submerged by their own deafness, their own blindness, their own numbness. Uh, I have really connected with this idea um, as I watch what I believe to be the demise of democracy. Something that I was not quite so aware I felt so strongly about until the time comes to see it fading away. I went to elementary school that had all of those pictures of the founding fathers, and every classroom that George Washington photo or a photo, that George Washington painting, with the white underneath him that kind of looks like a cloud. Supposedly that was an unfinished, portrait of Washington, but it has the effect when you're a little third grader of presenting George Washington in the clouds, right? Here is this deified figure. Abraham Lincoln, my goodness, I went to Lincoln Elementary School, Thomas Jefferson. This grand American experiment called democracy that has succeeded for so long. And I remember in the 60s, we're riding on the tail of uh, our victory in World War II, being the Allied savior, you might say. There was a lot of nationalism that went into that, but it wasn't the kind of it, it really was something where I felt a sense of democracy, of what democracy was all about. And I see that fading away now. And there is a grief that I feel. And what we're reading in chapter 3 here is really encouraging me to, I don't, the word is wallow isn't good, but to accept that, to live into that grief, because without the grief, as we learn in the chapter, newness cannot arise. Now, how I can express that grief in the way Jeremiah does to others, I don't know if I'm the person to do that. So, any thoughts on this? Well, you've been reading grief.
Dan, in,
Yes, sir.
in my margins, I would offer a counter to the notion of numbness. Um, and that is, I think most anthropologists would say, conventional culture, conventional wisdom is socialized into children worldwide, at a very tender age, as we've discussed earlier.
Sure.
And it's very difficult to make a choice to opt out of that culture when it is virtually universally accepted. And maybe, and this is what I'm reading, in between the lines on Brueggemann, that only a collapse of the social system, allows the latitude to re-examine whether it's the case of Moses, and the Israelites coming out of Egypt,
Right.
or it is the collapse of a regime, a form of government. Um, I'm not sure that, some kind of collective, let's, let's engage in prophetic imagination is really going to work that well unless there is a collapse of the system and you are faced with no alternative.
Right. Yeah, and this really is helpful as we move into Lent and think about death and resurrection as well. Um, and as I've already mentioned, incarnation, the embodiment of this grief that's so important um, uh, to Jeremiah. Uh, yes, a complete destruction and the picking up of the pieces, and maybe putting the pieces back together again. The pieces, of course, were pieces that were created out of an original archetype or original ideal that had its source in Moses that somehow went astray. All right, well, let's take that structure that went astray and try to cull from it in pieces uh, those aspects that were original to the structure itself, what we're calling the alternative community, the alternative consciousness, and then putting that back together. But I don't know, are we called as a church to encourage people to engage in, I mean, this is what Jeremiah was trying to do, and this is where I'm struggling. Uh, to engage in this grief, to recognize that things are falling apart. And we may be beyond the point of no return. I mean, this whole, I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound alarmist, but this whole uh, invasion, you might say, this kidnapping of Maduro, the admittedly, a rank character, somebody we don't need in this world, but it just flies in the face of everything that we've tried to represent on the international stage for years. It challenges NATO, especially if we go into Greenland. Let's see what happens there. But this idea, this new Monroe Doctrine that we're talking about, where we will rule by power and might, and we've got the right to do that. Uh, for me, that's the end of an era. That's the beginning of grief that the question I want to ask myself, if I'm called like Jeremiah in a kind of, outreach ministerial way, do I continue to hold on to this idea, well, it's going to get better, everything's going to be great? If I do, then I'm just simply part of the numbness, right? I'm not looking at the clock and seeing what time it is. Jeremiah knew what time it was. And so this is existential. It's existential for me. And I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to scare people or, be grandiose or you know, over dramatic. But I am having some issues with what's happening these days. So any other thoughts about this?
Dan, you should have issues because it is a fundamental kidnapping or um, a demonstration of how fragile belief systems are. If someone is willing to interpret, the public interest in a draconian way. And this is precisely what's happening right now. So it's not only the kidnapping of Maduro, the nasty guy, but he's a businessman. This is this is if Americans quit, purchasing in huge numbers, the cocaine and fentanyl and on and on and on and on, these people wouldn't exist. I mean, yeah. So yeah, you were absolutely. I think the prophetic imagination has always had to approach around the edges, you know, to try to raise awareness. But in terms of critical analysis, I don't see Walter Brueggemann. He's very good on empirical, dissecting what is happening, both
Right.
in time of Jeremiah and now. But as far as, how to extricate anybody, any culture from that situation is very questionable.
Yeah, right. And Jeremiah does see the temptation to fall into this false security. Look at this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, right? We see that early on. And in another place he says that the people go around saying peace, peace, everything is great, you know. But this lack of hearing, the peoples whose eyes are veiled and whose ears cannot hear, that sends him into a complete tailspin. And this grief is, if I can put it in Kantian terms, that Kant was the one that told us that, the way that we perceive the world works by certain categories. And the two basic categories on how we understand what we're perceiving is time and space. And then there are other aspects that go into how we qualify that time and space. But what Jeremiah is saying is that the whole world has been corrupted so that space itself is corrupted, Jerusalem, and time itself has been corrupted. This idea of the eternal now that the royal consciousness wants to try to perpetuate, right? We will live for and we shall live forever and ever, the thousand-year Reich idea, you might say, which interestingly, I don't see has raised its head so much here in the United States. This idea of what I'm calling corrupted time that we certainly saw in Nazi Germany, the beginning of the thousand-year reign of the Reich. Um, can anybody help me with this notion that Brueggemann is pointing out of the idea of forever? You know, this is not going to fail for we've seemed to become such a uh, immediate culture that thinking about a long future and this idea of, let's say, Trump's regime lasting forever just hasn't entered our consciousness yet. Any thoughts about that? Well, it certainly was, according to Brueggemann, in the consciousness of the people. The space of Jerusalem has been corrupted. And there's an
Dan?
aspect. Yeah, go ahead, Sharon.
I was sorry. I was just looking up to make sure I said her name correctly, but Marina Corina Machado is
Machado.
doing something. Um, she's gotten a Nobel Prize for it. And I think I probably, Danny, should read a lot more about what she's thinking and how she's behaving. But I don't think, well, I'll put it this way. She may have seen a sense of collapse at some point that put her in a situation of action at the level that obviously is risking her life.
Interesting.
Um, but it would be interesting to hear what motivated that and to what effect her counter to, I'll call it the mindset, if nothing else, of her own country, politically and economically, might succeed. Because she's on the wings. I mean, Trump's obviously pretty much ignoring her, thinking that he can control other people. Um, but that would be, I think, one of those things that should give us some sense of hope, albeit at a distance, about
Right.
what's happening to democracy and what could happen.
Right. So you're putting her in the role of Jeremiah in some ways, then, I think, right? She's embodying the grief of a lost nation, uh, so much so that's being recognized by the Nobel Committee. They give her the Nobel Peace Prize. What really upsets me about that whole thing is she somehow dedicated it to Donald Trump. Uh, what? I don't know what's going on there. And I mean, doesn't this just represent the absurdity of all of this? Somebody who's bombed eight different countries in the period of a year, is insisting that he be considered, if not considered, given whole hog, given the Nobel Peace Prize. Um, but I don't know enough about Machado to know how she has, what kind of poetic rhetoric she's used. Again, remember the Jeremiah has it says that the prophet, excuse me, Brueggemann says that the prophet has to speak in poetic terms because the narrative is is the language of the royal consciousness, and so poetry helps people, see things at a different level, at the level of the heart. Does anybody have a sense of what Machado's other than just being an alternative to Maduro? I wonder how she has inspired the people who voted for her. Anybody know? Denny?
My thoughts are Latin America has never been my area, but I'm wondering if some of her older friends who've been active in Venezuelan politics prior to Chavez in 1999, when Chavez came to power, are are not thinking back to when Venezuela was, producing a lot of oil and had a sort of democratic system that respected a lot of norms, and they would like to see that, reinstated. I think maybe kind of like Jeremiah.
Right. So democracy, the democracy that was original in Venezuela, whatever its form was, is kind of the alternative consciousness, so to speak, for Machado. Interesting. Um, yeah, may you live in interesting times. Well, we'll only have to follow and see what happens here. One thing I want to point out about Jeremiah that is really prophetic in a lot of ways, and that we don't really emphasize enough in our understanding of who we are. I mean, remember when I was talking earlier about how, you know, God and Judah are connected, and thus the people in Judah are also connected. It is their identity so that when the people grieve, the land will grieve as well, because their tears will seep. I'm speaking poetically here. Their tears will seep into the landscape, and that grief will just simply be a part of the whole community. And so Jeremiah does make reference to this in a way that Amos does as well when he was speaking to the alternative, excuse me, to the nation of Israel back in the 8th century. Uh, this idea really has its source in the royal consciousness. And I wanted to point this out because um, it has ecological ramifications. So I'll just say it that way. But you might recall the Yahwist narrative, which was the official narrative that was written by Solomon and represented the royal consciousness. And its emphasis on creation itself, right? That God is just not a tribal God of the people of Israel, but that God is somehow over all of creation. That being the case, then God's Messiah, Mashiach, God's anointed one, Solomon, or the kings who follow after him, uh, also has a connection to the created world. The idea being that if the king is righteous, then all of creation, not just the people, but all of creation um, will live in this very, very harmonious way. We will see this imagery again in Isaiah when we start looking at the language of amazement, when the wolf will lie down with the lamb, and the child will dance over the adder's den. That idea that all will be peaceful when the righteous king returns. Well, the corollary of that is the reverse is that when the king is unrighteous, I should point out my point here that the righteous king is kind of a guarantor of a well-balanced creation. This was implicit in the Yahwist narrative that was written at the time of Solomon around 950 BCE and is part and parcel, excuse me, part and parcel of the royal consciousness. It gives the king a kind of cosmic um, legitimacy, right? Gives him a kind of cosmic identity. Well, the corollary of that is if we see that the land itself is being corrupted, then we can conclude that the king must be corrupted as well. I want to read this place in Jeremiah. It's in Jeremiah chapter 4, and I'm on page 49 now. Um, and I'll talk about Jeremiah's grief for the people, then his grief for creation itself. My anguish, I writhe in pain, all the walls of my heart. My heart is beating wildly. I cannot keep silent, for I hear the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. Disaster follows hard on disaster, and the whole land is laid waste. Suddenly, my tents are destroyed, my curtains in a moment. And I looked on the earth, and lo, it was waste and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light. I looked on the mountains, and lo, they were quaking, and all the hills moved to and fro. I looked, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the air had fled. I looked, and lo, the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins before the Lord, before his fierce anger. So, this idea that space itself is corrupted due to the numbness of the royal consciousness that has been established, I think this is the beginning of what we will later see as apocalypticism. The idea that, the world, the cosmos itself is coming to an end, right? I don't know in the prophetic tradition if we've seen this kind of uh, focus before. Maybe a little bit in Amos, but the idea that, the world is off kilter, things just don't, things are crooked, things are not lining up, war prevails. And there's also this grief over corrupted time that we talked a little bit about in Jeremiah, that that the royal consciousness has tried to freeze time into a kind of forever. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Nothing is going to happen here. And this idea of forever works to the notion that the king will stay in place forever and ever. Uh, and it also established the principle that if you oppose the king, then you oppose the forever, and then you also oppose God as well. So it's very important to keep this idea present. And Jeremiah sees that forever is an illusion. It's not going to last. And there is a grief, therefore, over the identity of the people that has its foundation, just its most rudimentary foundation in corrupted space, Jerusalem and its king, and corrupted time. Remember, the time that is ever flowing is the time of the God of freedom. The forever time of the royal consciousness is the God in a box, the God who is manipulated by the royal consciousness. And so there's this grief over this lost identity. And as I was reading this, I was thinking about, or I'd really love to do more with this. And I don't know who's written on it, but if you read the Old Testament, if you read the idea that a person is called, right? You can see it in the Cain and Abel story. You can see it in Abraham. You can see it in where else? Oh, it's throughout the Hebrew Bible. In Samuel, for example, when God calls someone, the response in Hebrew is always, "Here I am." Here, this spatial representation, and then I, the sense of identity, and then this idea of being itself. And it has a double entendre, here I am, here I exist. But it's also a response to here, Yahweh, here I am. Remember, Yahweh's name means I am. So we see this throughout the Hebrew Bible. What's happened in Jeremiah's mind is that there is no more here I am. The knowledge of God has been completely lost. The knowledge of here and the knowledge of I and the knowledge of I am have completely dissipated. There's nothing left. And when there's no knowledge of God, there can be no knowledge of self. And the corollary of that, as we see in John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Faith, always good to bring up Calvin every now and then, there can be no knowledge of self without knowledge of God. There could be no knowledge of God without knowledge of self. The two go hand in hand, two sides of the same coin. That has been lost in Judah. Um, any thoughts about that before I move on? I want to pick up on the idea again of Jeremiah as a symbol of incarnation, embodied grief. The land grieves, and the people in their numbness are unable to grieve. And perhaps the most poignant image in all of Scripture, it's even picked up in Matthew as a fulfillment of prophecy, is this embodiment of a grief that is akin to the death of a child. Um, you know, there's let me read it here exactly so I don't, so I don't massacre it. A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. No, here I am, right? There is nothing there. Rachel, by the way, is the wife of Jacob, the progenitor of at least the one of the tribes, the 10 tribes at least of Israel, according to um, uh, their own mythology. There, you can't get a more heartbreaking image than a mother weeping for her child, her lost child. Um, I've never, obviously, I have children. I can't even imagine what it's like. But uh, time and time again, I've heard people refer to the wail that comes from a woman who's learned of the death of her child as unearthly, something that cannot even be described. And you all have, many of you have children, and I think you can perhaps begin to imagine what that's like. This is what Jeremiah is embodying. Uh, and it is the pain of God. And my goodness, I don't know why no one tends to pick up on this, but remember, we have to speak of God in terms of metaphors. Uh, and we've wanted for so long to hold on to the male metaphor. God is a he, right? And people just get all up in arms. But you can't get any clearer than this, that the metaphor here is God is Rachel weeping for her children. God is entirely female, the one who has given birth, not the one who is conceptually conceived, objectively, but who has given birth to the people of the covenant. They are no more. And the grief of a woman wailing for her child is what Jeremiah is trying to get across. But even that won't break the numbness of the people. Here, I just want to read what uh, Brueggemann has to say. Jeremiah has pressed where his contemporaries would not readily go, to the pain of God, to a place where only Hosea had ventured before. Remember Hosea, who was called to marry a woman of whoredom. Yahweh is no longer an enemy who must punish or destroy, but the helpless parent who must stand alongside death, like Mary at Calvary. And thus we have, this is why it's so important to read the prophets to understand some of the imagery in the New Testament. This is Rachel weeping for her child. Michelangelo's Pietà, Mary with the dead body of Jesus as a symbol of the pain, the overwhelming pain that God is feeling at the loss of Judah who is no more. And it's this pain and this grief that we must immerse ourselves in, says Jeremiah, because until we do, there can be no joy at the other end. There can only be numbness. And this is symbolic, of course, of the death and resurrection of Jesus. I'm not saying that Jeremiah was looking, 500 years ahead at the time that Jesus would come. No, but the symbolic image, the metaphor here is just right on point. There can be no language of amazement until we've passed through, the fiery river, as they say, of grief. Uh, so uh, this is what Brueggemann is trying to get across here, is that it's this prophetic criticizing and the embrace of pathos is a necessary precursor to this language of amazement, to this reconfiguring of the alternative consciousness that had its source uh, at the foot of Mount Sinai. This reconfiguring of a covenant community. It's now all in pieces. There is no more, but it will, if you allow me to say, it will rise again. Um, so before I read this Brueggemann quote, if you have any thoughts or questions about this, please let me know. Because as we move into Lent, I think this is such nice imagery to keep before us.
I'm finding this fascinating because as I move into preaching for Lent, I'll be preaching on Jeremiah,
Good.
and leaning back into Brueggemann as we did during Advent. And so our conversation today is just stirring lots of things as I dig deeper into what we'll be talking about the first Sunday in Lent.
Great. Yeah, we'll have a chance to talk some more, I'm sure, Andrea, about this. Um, yeah, Jeremiah is not easy to read. He's one of the major prophets. It's, 50 or however many chapters there are, and some of it's just incomprehensible. We're used to reading narrative. We want to read history. And the Bible just isn't history. The Bible is a representation of the pathos of people's experience in times of trouble as well as in times of great joy. And that can only be expressed well in poetry. So Jeremiah is often just ignored because I don't get it. There are some narrative parts that are easy to read, but most of it is this, these prophetic announcements that are poetic and metaphorical. Um, and we we've no longer I don't think we encourage our kids to recite poetry anymore. Uh, did you all have to recite poetry when you were in elementary school? Learn poems? Um, I remember, and it's amazing that I remember this. I was in fourth grade, Mrs. Ball, and she was introducing us to there. Here we go again, American poetry, right? And I read "Oh Captain, My Captain," Walt Whitman, and I got it. It's like, oh my gosh, I get this in a way that I was different. I got it down here, not up here. Um, and I'm so grateful that I had that experience because not every poem does that. But I could see how speaking metaphorically just opens new doors. And this, of course, is what Jeremiah does, and it's going to be, of course, what Isaiah does so well, but just on the other side of the coin. So let me just conclude our little discussion today with Brueggemann's conclusion, and this lies at the end of chapter 3. Then I'll give you an opportunity for the last word. The riddle and insight of biblical faith is the awareness that only anguish leads to life. Only anguish leads to life. Only grieving leads to joy, and only embraced endings permit new beginnings. After Jeremiah comes Jesus of Nazareth, who understands grief as the ultimate criticism that had to be addressed against Jerusalem. Without it, there is no newness. And then this final paragraph that I really like so well, Jesus knew what we numb ones must always learn again. That weeping must be real because endings are real. Weeping must be real because endings are real. And B, that weeping permits newness. Weeping permits newness. It's the key that unlocks that door. It means the end of all machismo. What a great word to use in 2026. It means the end of all machismo. Weeping is something kings rarely do without losing their thrones. Yet the loss of thrones is precisely what is called for in radical criticism. I think that's great. Uh, Anybody want to mention anything here or thoughts, questions?
Oh, Dan, I'll just weigh it again that
Please do.
I I'm not sure that people who have been beaten down, people who have lost status, and I'm thinking going clear back to uh, the rise of David and Solomon, clear up to the American experience for the blue collar folks after World War II, that the response very seldom, it seems to me, is in the direction that Walter Brueggemann would like to see it go.
Yeah,
It seems to me that it is very, very easy for that mindset to sink into
despair.
not only, no, I'm not sure about despair, but anger and
Oh,
retribution. And somebody is at fault here besides me, and Donald Trump, in many ways, embodied that for, a huge, huge number of people.
yeah,
It had to resonate, and it did not go in what sociologists would call a U-functional direction, which means we're coming
EU.
together
Yeah,
in a positive, let's build this back up again in a way that'll protect the community. Rather, it goes the other way in terms of almost right on the cusp of anarchy, of, just flailing.
yeah.
And
But go ahead. Sorry.
no, I just don't see much historical example throughout the last several 3,000 years, where the downtrodden, have opted for, Walter Brueggemann's optimism. I would love to see us opt for his optimism, but I don't think the data bears it out.
Well, to that, and I agree with what you're saying, but to that, I would say that is why you need a prophet. I mean, the one caveat I would offer to what you're talking about is look what happened to the African American community in the 1960s under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, and it didn't happen as a grass. Well, it without Martin Luther King Jr., I think that would have fallen into a kind of despair and the kind of race riots that, the people in the 60s were predicting, with Charlie Manson tried to provoke one of those to happen, right? Martin Luther King Jr. gave them a metaphorical um, image of hope. He's been to the mountaintop, boom, drawing on that metaphor that they all understood as part of their collective understanding of Scripture. And I think that, they were at their wits' end. They were, picking up the pieces of what it meant to be African American or Black in the 1960s, and it instilled new hope, precisely what Jeremiah was trying to do. So while I agree with what you're saying, um, this is why prophets is so necessary, right? We need somebody who can pull all this together, identify with the suffering, name it for what it is, help people to see it for what it is, but then lead them into a kind of collective weeping, and then offer something new. I dream of a day when every black boy and black girl are in the classroom together, that whatever, however Martin Luther King said it. I mean, perfect example of criticism and energizing. So don't leave me in despair, Denny. I gotta have just one little grain of hope.
Well, then we might see another FDR, as imperfect as that was. But there again, the depression was so overwhelming
Yeah,
that many people simply did not see that there was much alternative, and FDR had the charisma, to seemingly make it work.
right. Yeah,
I do not see that today, with the average middle class, whatever white is. Uh,
yeah,
I've got mine, Jack. What's your problem?
right, right. Yeah, the numbness has set in for sure. Well, we are right in the middle of the book, and we're about to make, that turn from the deep dark night of the soul to the early morning resurrection when we start looking at the prophet Isaiah, because the criticizing and the embrace of pathos is not the last word. The last word is one of hope and the one of energizing. And Isaiah is the prophet who does that so well. And then our last two chapters are going to place Jesus precisely in the middle of this tradition. So I hope you continue to read and enjoy what you're reading. And I will see you. I'll see you again. Let me see. When is that? I guess it's next Wednesday. The whatever the date is would be the 14th. All right, everyone. Thank you.
Chapter 4 next time.
Chapter 4, beginning chapter 4, correct. See you later.